Good afternoon, bonjour, assalamu alaikum, greetings from Montreal to you, my beloved Alberta colleagues. And what a joy it is to be with you this day as we approach what is perhaps the most needed holiday of our lives. And if you're here after a year of Zoom meetings, it's likely because you have outstanding capacity in your eyeballs, or perhaps because you were curious to know, what could a half Indian, half Scottish Anglican priest and charity director have to share with you about the future of our cities and towns? What even about the future of Edmonton? Throughout this pandemic year, we've learned about flattening curves, avoiding the burst of social bubbles, and now mDNA, I think, vaccines, and the impacts of printing money. You may have watched your investment portfolios crash and for some begin to recover. But what about those sectors which may never, ever look the same? As a Quebecer, dependent on the price of unleaded to power my family 4x4, I come to you as a middle of Canada observer. You may try to pin down my political allegiances, but as a graduate in diplomatic studies from London School of Economics, I come well prepared to encourage you to believe that from east to west, Canada's cities share a common challenge. What will we do with a sector of our economy often overlooked and known as social purpose real estate? These are hospitals, schools, parks, churches, museums, and more. Perhaps we should flatten them all and build condos everywhere, right? Endless elevators, ever decreasing square footage, and a destruction of the very fabric of what it means to be Canadian. Of course, my suggestion is the exact opposite. I believe that these unique landmarks call for a new place in a new economy. I believe that faith itself will see a renaissance, not as the old European warring denominations against some bearded bogeymen, but rather a new expression of place and opportunity for Canadians to create exactly the kind of community resilience that money really cannot buy. My own story began growing up in Guelph, Ontario, leading to the United Kingdom, a few degrees, and eventually being ordained at St. Paul's Cathedral as an Anglican minister. I was attracted to a community of faith, but also to a new team set up in our national church denomination there called the Closed Churches Team of the Church of England. I had the privilege of reopening 4 historic city centre churches as a priest, as a pastor, and now my life is dedicated to doing something of the same, but under the banner of a civic or secular charity called the Trinity Centres Foundation, whose aim is to see 100 church properties around Canada transformed into wider community assets. Why, though, should you care? Isn't it the case that our most tragic moments in Canadian history have happened through isolation and separation, a misunderstanding of each other, a separation of everyday Canadians simply because they were unable to hear and listen? One of my dear friends served until recently as the Director of Counter-Terrorism for the British government. He wrote this: "Building and facilitating genuine and authentic community networks has proven to be the most effective way of growing social cohesion and countering the toxic narrative of extremism and organized crime." Yet the Ontario Nonprofit Network announced at the beginning of the pandemic that at least 1/5 of its members would close permanently. In the USA, the Barna Group predicted that same number, 1/5 of churches would close permanently. Towards the end of the pandemic, most of the pundits I listen to have stopped giving figures on the demise of Canada's social sector. As so many of Canada's major retailers have declared bankruptcy, how much worse must it be for the nonprofits? Yet churches in Canada still control over $35 billion in land and assets. In the USA, that number is nearly $500 billion US. In some ways, we could trust the market and hope that these community groups will start again in new ways. That is my prayer. But in the meantime, what about the land? Of Canada's 28,000 churches, at least 10,000 will close and sell in this next season. More than half of those own land, much of it being heritage property. Canada's church properties themselves represent about $20 billion in land value, and alongside that, about that much again in church savings. Church pensions are over $6 billion. And not a dime of that is currently invested in steering into a community-based finance recovery in the same stock of assets. In Peterborough, the heritage planner there told me, he said, "Graham, I got 7 demolition orders on my desk. You told me you were going to get all those bloody churches meeting in cinemas, moving into the downtown, and it hasn't happened yet. What are you doing? Well, I asked him what he was doing about it, underlining that as a municipality and as a planner there, he has the power to convene far greater than any one charity or business. He told me he wasn't sure what he'd say if he did gather all the churches and charities, and we told him that we probably knew what to say, and these are the rays of hope that we look to for 2021. Churches began as a colonial accoutrement, right? These days, if you build a new housing development, you put a Shoppers Drug Mart and an RBC, and you expect all those first-time home buyers to kind of stump up their cash. Now, back in the day, the Hudson's Bay Company days, the amenities of that day were churches. Build Presbyterian and the Scottish will come. Then the English will come straight after and build a slightly bigger steeple across the road. In Alberta, however, your pattern was different. In some cases, far wiser German and Dutch settlers preferred acreage rather than street corners. And of the many differences between Upper and Lower Canada and the prairies in the West is indeed the differences in the landowning of the settler churches and their rural and urban vision. Solving these challenges for the future, however, may in fact become a tool of national unity, just as the days of railroads and phone lines speak to us of the power of social infrastructure. Government needs to get much more serious about joining Canada's community foundations, granting and family foundations, and leadership communities like this Canadian Club in addressing the many outstanding issues of land sale regulations, long-standing tax exemptions, and the community expectation placed on them, and ultimately the ethical questions around what should happen with the riches of these lands, which were given in many cases in contexts of problematic First Nations justice, waves of European migration, and a whole host of colonial problems, which, by the way, I deal with extensively in a major interview published by our national Anglican newspaper this Christmas, and I've written similar pieces for the Montreal Gazette and even your very own Edmonton Journal. And just across from the Journal, it is our joy to be working with your very own McDougall United Church. In some cases, a typical specimen of a very old beast of a building and one of the best locations in your city, along with a dwindling yet faithful crew of community-minded parishioners. Very little money left, mounting bills, McDougall has decided to put all their chips in and come up with a radical new plan. We are the authors of that plan, and we need some contributing editors for the plan, folks. This is an Edmonton story, and we are simply the conversation gatherers. What could you do to dream in a place like McDougall, for starters? In Montreal, we've turned one of that city's oldest and most old-fashioned churches into a place where 6 faith communities, 50 nonprofits, and even our own circus company, which you saw a moment ago, share a heritage space. In Toronto, we've helped sell United Church to the Boys and Girls Club of Toronto, issue a vendor take-back mortgage, and become a long-term tenant in the newly formed youth center. In Calgary, it's our privilege to be working with an independent church who's sitting on 4 acres of land with an LRT stop on its top corner. We're dreaming of what impactful housing could be, while also dreaming of the opening of the church's own space outward, creating a true 21st century community asset. In Quebec City, we're trying to referee a round of, it feels a little bit like ultimate fighting between the municipality and their Catholic archdiocese. One quoting canon law and the other claiming the law. In Guelph, we threatened all the downtown churches with the charge of dereliction of their duties as charitable trustees if they didn't at least talk to each other before putting their churches on the market at the same time. We were able to talk them down. In Toronto, we're helping the Catholics sell to the Unitarians, and so on. This is a time of great transition, and I hope I don't need to spell out the specter of demolition and condos in each case. This is an example of where pure market forces will yield an urbanistic, community, and societal result which simply needs more guidance, more leadership, more people like you. As you look to the end of this year, perhaps it's your tradition to visit a food bank or drop off a turkey or two. And with COVID, those mechanisms are few and far between. My invitation to you is to ask, how will you roll up your sleeves as a leadership community of this Canadian club and truly shape the future of the social purpose real estate in your city? so that no one is left behind. This is the hard, complicated, and risky new work of social impact finance. But I would hazard a guess that some of you gathered here today have faced hard, complicated, and risky opportunities throughout the whole of your lives. What would Edmonton and what would Canada be if you leaned in to this challenge? I wish you a fruitful discussion on this theme and a very happy Christmas as you dream this dream together. Thank you once again for the privilege of being with you this day.
That was great, Graham. I really enjoyed that, actually. And I know some folks would look at the circus aspects at St. Jack's, and I invite you to tell us a little bit more about how St. Jack's is going. But I know you just use that as an example. I mean, I've often teased the congregation at McDougall that they should put a zip line across the valley to the Mootart. So, you know, thinking outside the box is I think a lot about what TCF has to offer to municipalities, to local governments, to congregations, to owners of historic buildings, is that opportunity to imagine something quite different from what its original purpose was. So I've really enjoyed that. And, you know, I think it's great to have an optimistic message as we depart this horrible year. And I know we have some hard months ahead of us. But nonetheless, you know, it's really great to get an optimistic message. I was watching some polling data just before this, a presentation, and that's pretty grim. So this has been a welcome change. And I invite you to, you know, speak further to the folks that have assembled today. We have about 40 plus online. And continue that message. Tell us a little bit more about St. Jack's and what your thoughts are for McDougall and Edmonton and Calgary.
Well, thanks so much, Paul. And it really is great to see everybody. And it's, you know, your questions as we were getting ready for this, we could go in so many different directions. I was glad to have given that little pre-recorded chunk to make sure I kind of stayed on message. But when I think about, and these are, you can make some huge generalizations, but in general, faith communities in Montreal will be generally more liberal than faith communities in Alberta. So the idea of putting a circus in a church in Montreal makes a heck of a lot more sense than doing the same thing in Edmonton. Now, every time I've said something like that, somebody's caught me, you know, off guard. I had some guys from Dallas, Texas once. They said, don't ever talk about Dallas that way. We've got the exact same pressures in the heart of our downtown. So I don't make any assumptions about Edmonton that way. But I would say that the world is watching. And they really, for those people who call themselves people of faith, I think there is an opportunity to understand and re-express that faith as saying we can express our faith and be committed believers while not necessarily having to control the physical space that we work or minister out of. And it brings up this concept of really what I would call sacred space. And so when a circus company comes into a space and they say, we've now made this into a sacred space for circus, there are all kinds of things about the lights and the smoke and the cabaret style seating around there that makes them feel like they're at home. Of course, a German, let's say a Mennonite background church believer will have a completely different view than a French Québécois Catholic believer. They have a different view of sacred space. But the idea of saying, I love my sacred space and I need to control it in order to be present in the city is something that I think we've left behind. And I think it's good that we do. And I think that's where the opportunity is to say somebody might say sacred space for me is out in the middle of a field where I can see, the creator's beauty. And there is the place where they join with people of all faiths, for instance, and they may have a different view that way. So I would say Montreal is an example of a place where we got to push the envelope a little bit further. And so when we show video of circus in Montreal, in fact, there's one church, ironically, I don't mean to pick on German background folks. My wife is a German speaker, but we did show a ballerina in a church in another very German part of Canada. And that became known as the ballerina moment when we pushed the envelope too far. And everybody said, oh, we can handle everything you're talking about, Graham, but just that ballerina in the middle of the church, that just, that blows our mind. However, as soon as we say that, there are other folks who've dismissed faith communities as being something, a relic of the past. And certainly, Paul, you and I have had opportunity to talk about when it gets to the federal government and faith communities do not mix for a whole bunch of reasons. And we want to challenge that. We want to say actually faith is an integral part, and the inheritance of faith communities in these properties is an integral part of how Canada came to be. And we need to restate what we do with this property in the future. And as you know, Paul, in preparation for today, thinking more broadly about the interests of the Canadian Club in Edmonton, to look at this as a category and look back, and I think now is a good time to look back. What difference did railways make to Canada? What difference did telephone lines? How has this country, what in the leadership of the formation of Canada, as much as we lament it from time to time, right? I remember last time I was in Alberta, I joined I joined one of the radio talk shows in Calgary, talking about mon éducation en français en Ontario, et comme j'ai appris le français en Ontario, and being a half Indian guy, being able to speak French in Quebec is an oddity, right? But when you look at that, weird things like learning French in Manitoba, maybe, or obviously it's a little bit. There are other reasons to learn French in Manitoba, but my point is there are odd things that bother us about Canada, right? As we look east to west, but that also, if we do our Canadian history, we realize this is the essential part of how we formed Canada. We decided not just to go north-south, we decided to go east-west. And I really do present this issue of what do we do? I mean, that's the question. What the heck do we do with all these churches? And then, by the way, what about those Catholic hospitals and those schools and those museums? And who's looking after those? How are they funded? Do we care? Are they worth anything? And you realize the answer is yes to all of them, but usually, and you'll have the Premier coming shortly and sharing his vision and his priorities. There are a lot of other priorities around, and this is something that I'm so glad to have the opportunity to stick up for it and say, you know what? As we look ahead now, our children and our grandchildren will be asking us, what were the next moves you made after COVID, right? This is a situation as significant as the Second World War or the Great Depression for different reasons, right? We're at 300,000, I think, Americans have died now from COVID-19. Yeah. People will want to know, what did you do about it? What priorities did you have? And I think it's for that reason that it's not only about turning churches into community hubs, it's about thinking, how is the fabric of our society built and what are we going to do about it in the future?
Those are really good points, Graham. I appreciate that. I'm kind of hoping that as you continue your work with Calgary and now with McDougall in Edmonton, and you find new opportunities in this province, and I'm hoping that Albertans surprise you. There's a change. There's been a change over the years. We have a Muslim mayor in Calgary, for example. Who would have thought that was possible? 5 years ago we elected an NDP government. Whoever thought that was going to be possible? And the NDP leader remains very popular to this day. So there's changes afoot in Alberta for sure, and I hope you find fertile ground here. What's been your experience with the shared usage, and that can, where are your challenges there? I know that there are specific challenges when you're sharing congregations. When I was with the military, we were combining Roman Catholic and Protestant chapels, for example, into one building, and I was surprised at how many challenges there were. With 6 congregations at St. Jack's, and I'm sure that's not your only experience, you must have had that. And then, of course, sharing with nonprofits and entities like circuses. Can you elaborate a little bit on the challenges that you face there?
Sure. I mean, I can tell you on the other side of it, we've got one project that's gone into mediation. And you, Paul, who with another hat on, are a big champion of the role of mediation. In Alberta and beyond. There are times where this sharing is hard, but it's in the backdrop of looking, and you look at a church like McDougall, and I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk a bit more about. You look at a church like that and you think, what an impossible situation. It's impossible to think of these huge multi-million-dollar bills for renovation, but it's also impossible to think about demolition. And so in the context of an impossible situation, sharing a space is often, we believe, the best starting point. But of course, it yields conflict, and it gives rise to the need for people who are experts at this. And we're very privileged to have quite a few people like that around, whether they be lawyers or mediators. In fact, accountants are very helpful. I mean, Trinity Centres, in some ways, we've joked and said, if you just let a bunch of lawyers and accountants loose on all the empty churches in Canada, you'd end up with something like the Trinity Centres Foundation. That's not entirely true. But we've kind of joked about that to say the sharing from a pure accounting basis is a need to have. And if you look at somebody younger, and I don't know the age profile of our audience today, but let's say somebody my parents' age, my dad will begin seeing his 80s pretty soon. The idea of sharing a home when they're on vacation is a bit of a nonsense. Whereas somebody closer, to their 40s, they go away on holiday. If they were to go for an extended holiday to Australia, let's say, well, they wouldn't think twice about putting their house on Airbnb for a month, right? So the expectations of space sharing are different across generations. That's a point to be made. And from there, I would say, actually, we've been surprised that the sharing across denominations has not been as difficult as we thought, partly because a lot of churches, a lot of Canada's best churches, in fact, are using rented facilities. Cineplex Odeon, 25% of Cineplex Odeon's non-film business in Canada, so that's everything other than movies, is renting to churches. In fact, in another group I'm part of called Church Planning Canada, Cineplex Odeon was one of our corporate sponsors for that conference because so many churches rent cinemas. Now, of course, cinemas have been decimated by COVID-19, and one of the few groups that still gets to meet are funny, pointy, steeple-looking buildings called church buildings. Well, they've been able to continue meeting. That's one of the reasons why we have so many churches sharing the building, for instance, at St. Jack's. And you mentioned a little bit more, St. Jack's, to give you an urban view of that, we have 4 Starbucks within 100 meters of that location. So it's a very dense urban area, and transport links right there. And I think I just want to pick up, Paul, if you don't mind, the question about Alberta and Quebec, because this is it's a fun, also deep and serious issue to deal with. And I really meant it when I said, what if actually this question itself could be part of the kind of unity? And I think as Albertans and Quebecers, and I claim to be an Ontarian just for the minute if we need some neutrality, we all need to do everything we can, I think, to build bridges. And one of the most hilarious bridges that I've found is between, bizarrely, Quebec and Texas. And you think, how would that ever, well, think about it, right? There are 2 jurisdictions that consider themselves more of their own country than they are part of the wider country they're part of, right? They both have a very strong rural connection. So if you're a pure laine Québécois, pure wool, what they call pure wool Québécois, which is a problematic phrase, by the way, when it comes to racial identity, but it means you've been there, since the original French settlers. You will point to the place where your family farm is, right? Very often, same as in Texas. Well, what's another funny connection? Alberta and Texas. So, I mean, I don't mean to sound as crazy as saying, what if the key to Alberta-Quebec unity is via Texas? But here's where I'm going with this. If you think about Texas, you think about the Bible Belt, and you think about very well-established, the churches of the South. The biggest denomination down there is a Southern Baptist Convention, part of the Baptist movement. And one of my dear, dear friends and close colleagues is the former head of church planting for that movement. And he's now back up in Canada. He's on our board of advisors for the Trinity Centres Foundation, as is the United Church of Canada. So we have, in a sense, some of the most liberal Christians and some of the most conservative Christians agreeing to come around this question of what do we do? And I think there's hope to be found in that. I'll say one more thing about sharing, very practically, because some of you may be wondering, how on earth do you put a circus, in a church? Well, we have at St. Jack's, we have 2 tests for the circus folks. One is around the concept of evil. So we don't prescribe how somebody describes good and evil in our building. If they're a faith community, they get to decide that for themselves and present their own beliefs, which I think is a fundamental freedom. But what we do ask is that people try to help resolve evil for good before somebody leaves the building. And you mentioned it's nice to have a ray of hope at the end of this year. Well, we hope that whatever people present in terms of messages in our buildings, that they leave people feeling better than they came when they came in. So we want evil to have some kind of resolution. And of course, any kind of dramatic presentation. I mean, Shakespeare, for heaven's sake, many of Shakespeare's stories would not be considered compatible with the Christian faith. But yet you often see justice is done somehow at the end. And so we put that same expectation on our artistic partners, like the circus. The other is around nudity. And you might have seen in that video. And we have a very clear rule that says if really people, what they're wearing has a fundamental link to their form of art, then it might be kosher, as it were. If it's really not, and about the kind of misrepresentation of the human body, then we ask that that's moderated. And we often say, you know, what if the most influential Catholic cardinal in Canada turned up at the show? How would they feel about it? And this is part of this middle ground we're trying to find. Say, how can we influence each other? The circus folks can say, hey, Catholic bishop, do you realize we're far more influential than you are in the province of Quebec? And the Catholic bishop can say, hey, isn't there something in the background here about human dignity and about how we work? And in fact, what we found is these groups get along like a house on fire. They're so glad to have this interaction, and these silos and separation of these groups, we're starting to see coming down.
Graham, those are fascinating examples of problems encountered and problems solved. And you're right, it's, you know, if you dig deep enough, and of course we know this in the field of mediation where I work, as you've alluded to, if you dig deep enough, there's always that common thread that you can bring people together. Now, I do invite the listeners to tap in any questions that they might have preferably into the chat function. It's easier for me to monitor that. Vicky has asked the question, you know, our churches, maybe you can give some more examples to expand upon her question, but are churches considering using their land as a base for affordable housing and communities, childcare, people services, and the like? Some of the examples of that are out there, some might be well within the box, but there's certainly some that are outside the box too.
So Vicky, thanks for the question. And we have really a wonderful announcement that we've only just been allowed to make now because of the way these kind of announcements go. But we are part of a national group led by L'Arche Canada, a very well-known charity that works in the area of mental health and support, particularly for adults living with reduced mental ability. L'Arche is quite a well-known organization, and CMHC, which is now known as Housing Canada, formerly the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. It's our largest crown corporation in Canada, and we have been like beating down their door, saying, you know, for heaven's sake, guys, can we please have a more in-depth conversation about affordable housing? The reason I say more is there's one denomination in Canada, and I will single them out. It's the United Church of Canada. They are head and shoulders above the rest in trying to figure out the problems around affordable housing. The problem with the United Church is it tends to have more heritage buildings in central locations. So in order to build any kind of housing, you need to demolish some part, or if you've got green space, you're going to lose the green space. You need to densify, right? When it's a heritage building, it's harder to do that. Now, if I dip over to Calgary with, as Paulie mentioned, our partner there is Bow Valley Christian Church. And I want to be careful here because we're still in an exploratory stage there. I can say that questions that church was asking before COVID and before this last crisis in the oil markets, it looked different in Calgary than it does now. And as people may know, there are in a number of municipalities in Alberta, land is being given away for affordable and social housing. So if you own a piece of land and you want to sell some of it in order to, you know, kind of help with your main mission and do that kind of thing, I have to say in Alberta right now, that is incredibly difficult. Add to the fact that the economics around social and affordable housing, and those are quite different. Social housing is incredibly difficult to deliver. It used to be kind of, and similar to what used to be called subsidized housing. Affordable housing is different. Affordable is about a reduction in the market rate, is more attainable. But honestly, we could get more into this if you like. Questions, great to keep going with these questions on here. It is very, very difficult for any entity that owns land to deliver affordable housing, even harder for a church property. However, our new partnership with CMHC via L'Arche Canada is focused in New Brunswick. And New Brunswick is also a challenging economic environment, I would say, like the oil-dependent aspects of Alberta. There are different pressures on the economy in New Brunswick. But it's really exciting to see the different groups that have come together around that, and we're there. So that's not an answer to say we got it cornered, no problem. It's more to say, absolutely, this is a major focus for us. We as the Trinity Centres Foundation do not directly deliver housing solutions. However, on about half of our projects, a big part of what's being proposed is in fact the construction of housing. And again, I just mentioned how hard it is to actually get that to be affordable rather than market-based housing. So Paul, I see a next question on here with the
Epiphany has asked, I guess, for just a couple things. She's asked for a little bit more detail on overcoming those obstacles to sharing congregations. And of course, Gordon has asked about how St. Jack's came to be named. He spelt it Jacks, but I found this fascinating little business card from St. Jack's. So it's actually JAX. And yeah, please elaborate on those two points.
I'll tell you that. So we're not claiming that some saint called Jax was hanging around at Jesus' birth and nobody noticed until now, and we've uncovered the hidden gospel of Jax. It's simply that on St. Catherine Street in Montreal, where that church is located, there were two St. James's churches. And you may have this, and I'm sure you have this in Alberta in different places. There was St. James United and St. James Anglican. And back in the day, of course, there's no problem. Everybody understood the difference between a United Church and an Anglican Church. Today, in 2020 in Montreal, nobody understands. Not even the Anglicans of United understand the difference. In fact, we had people from the 1970s who reported going to the wrong St. James's for their, guests of their wedding went to the wrong one. It's about a kilometer down the road. So when we came in with this project of reopening the church, which the formal name of the church is St. James the Apostle Anglican Church, we said, boy, it might be a good time for a new name, which is bilingual. So it's typical of Montreal where they invent bilingual sounding names. So Jax is neither English nor French. And it's a little bit more secular friendly. It's a little bit less churchy than saying, hey, why don't you come and, be part of this conference at St. James the Apostle Anglican Church. And so St. Jax was born. We had actually the head of one of Canada's major consumer brands was in our church. He was a very good marketing guy. He is a very good marketing guy. He's moved back to Europe now. And he helped us with some of the branding on there. So that's a bit of the story, how we got to St. Jack's.
That's a great story. It's and I'm glad Gordon asked the question, because I've always been curious since we first started talking about St. Jack's myself. There's a couple of comments in the chat column there, Graham, about the Sisters of Providence in Kingston and about Homeward Trust here in Edmonton and Alberta that I'm familiar with both of those organizations, surprisingly. If there's anything there you want to comment on, please do. And also John has asked, some communities are having problems with cultural disparity and racism. Has any of your project work touched on these issues and integrating and cohesion issues?
Yeah. So I'll go to Sisters of Providence first, because they're a wonderful group in Kingston. They own a 30-acre property there, and their main partner guiding through this is actually the Ottawa Affordable and Social Housing Group, set up by the municipality, did so well at building affordable housing. They created their own development arm called CADCO. CADCO then have been reaching out to some of the monastic communities like the Sisters of Providence and helping them look at their properties. So isn't that a wonderful journey from municipality to setting up a not-for-profit developer? That then not-for-profit developer then is working with the Sisters of Providence. Now, as it happens, we have a Kingston project, St. Paul's Anglican in Kingston, and we've been kind of gently joining forces. And it turns out, as these things happen, the pastor's secretary used to be part of, Sisters of Providence, and so we've just been coming together. And if you go back to what I was saying about the city of Peterborough, saying if only we could talk about these things together. In fact, we may be, you cannot deliver social and affordable housing on every one of the church properties in a city. And Paul, I'm sorry, I meant to close the loop on this question earlier, why I love the United Church so much and what they're doing with this area of housing, but why they cannot do it on their own, and why, in fact, the founder of their group in the United Church of Canada is on our Council of Advisors, to say that where we need to look at this is as street corners. So if in Kingston you've got 30 acres owned by a Catholic monastic group and a beautiful little church and a cemetery owned by an Anglicans, well, guess what? The Presbyterians aren't very far away, and the Baptists aren't very far away, and they're all facing the same challenge, which is why we believe these need to be looked at neighborhood by neighborhood. So Sisters of Providence, in that case, I don't want to pick on them too much, but they do have the biggest of all those properties. And if you know anything about Catholic monastic orders, there are very few of these sisters left anymore. The monks died off a long time ago. and there are very, very few left. And they are trying to find ways to do this. And we're quite excited to be in those conversations.
Yeah,
Now,
Kingston's a lovely city. I have a cottage in Kingston, so you know that Church Street is named appropriately for the multitude of churches offered there.
absolutely.
But I'll let you move on to the next question.
You mentioned about racial tensions, and I'll tell you one fun story on this. I remember coming in. So we have one of Montreal's, one of the province of Quebec's largest refugee charities is one of those nonprofits that I mentioned that's based at St. Jack's. And in that case, they use the building for lots of different things, including World Refugee Day, which is celebrated every year in June, which is United Nations declared Day of Remembering the Refugee. At one point, I came into the church, and all the lights were off, and out came these 6 very large men with very significant beards and turbans, and I had no idea who they were or what they were doing in the church. And in fact, they were there as part of a dramatic presentation they were preparing. They were rehearsing for World Refugee Day, talking about how difficult it had been coming out of Syria. And the way they wanted to rehearse and do the show, and we gave over the church to the way they wanted to do it. Now, I'm happy to make fun of my own, background a little bit. I hope that it's not too touchy to do so. But, as a half white, half brown kind of guy, I can fit into quite a few different racial environments without, attracting too much attention. But I can say, our Bible study course at St. Jack's, we have 45 people this term on that, half of whom are from Iran in downtown Montreal. And it's absolutely amazing. So I would say more racial joys and discoveries than anything else. And in terms of tensions, here's where I'll go a little bit deeper on this. The old white churches, and I've written about this in Montreal Gazette, in Municipal World, the famous magazine for urban planners, and it's about to come out in this Anglican newspaper. The old white churches of Canada with the biggest steeples have the most money. The ones down by the river. The black churches are the crummy ones that look like they got hit by an ugly stick of architecture out in the poor end of the suburbs. They had very little money. And of course, I'm making huge generalizations. I'm sure there's some very, very beautiful black majority churches in Canada. Mark my words. However, for the most part, the racial divides that led to the building of many of Canada's churches inherited the socioeconomic position of that racial group from 40 years ago, 50 years ago. So as those churches close and they might want to try to cash in on their land resources, of course, the value of those lands are very different. So the racial tensions built into Canada's church architecture are deep and wide. And, as I mentioned in a couple of places I've written, I'm not aware of any of Canada's mainline Protestant churches or Catholic churches, and by that I mean Anglican United, Catholic, Presbyterian, Lutheran to some extent. I'm not aware of any turning one of their closed churches into a First Nations center.
Yeah.
I'm aware of quite.
And you're so right, Graham, because there's numerous examples of marginalized communities that have inadvertently found themselves on valuable land and it's expropriated. I mean, Africville in Halifax is a classic example of a black community that just disappeared, essentially. That's really helpful and it's insightful, I think, to some of the challenges that we might face. Bob is a member, I know, of the McDougall congregation, and he has kind of a specific question about the heritage status. But you can probably broaden that to, your dealings with all kinds of heritage status churches across the country. And he asks just about, the approvals and the complications that you might encounter when dealing with a property that has been deemed historical. Yeah. And McDougall certainly has a rich history of hosting the Edmonton Symphony, the Edmonton Opera, and hundreds and hundreds of concerts over the years. So it's a cultural center already, but it's historically designated.
Yeah. So we have I'm actually not quite, but I hope throughout next year I will receive my designation from the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals. And I believe I will be the first ordained person to hold that designation, which is held by many engineers and architects and very skilled builders. So it's a very important heritage designation in Canada, CAP. It's part or is associated with the National Trust for Canada for whom I'm a regular speaker and writer. And we are partners with the National Trust for Canada in a number of areas. That's the overall body that to which all local heritage groups report into. The National Trust for Canada does not control the local heritage activists or the local municipal heritage planners. However, they are the thought leader in that area, and it's my privilege to be part of that conversation. And I've spoken in that environment many times about reducing the cost of heritage renovations, or what they call adaptive reuse of heritage buildings. And every time what comes up is, of course, the impossibility around, Bob, what you're raising of code issues. So the correct answer with most heritage buildings is demolish the building. It's beyond repair. You know, there's no way you'll get it up to code, because once you start touching one piece of wire to fix a disabled bathroom, universal access bathroom, well, you find that that wire might be a cloth insulated wire that you need to go and look all the way back. But when you look back, you find some asbestos to get access to the wire. Then you need to move a pipe, which is, for heaven's sake, it's a lead pipe. And then you trace that lead pipe back and you wonder how far do those go back. And then you find there's another part of the building that didn't have any kind of universal access. And it goes on and on and on. What's been so fun, maybe fun is the wrong word, but it has been enjoyable for me, is to get into the conversations with the urban planners and the municipal folks, to say to them honestly, sometimes over a scotch, I have to say, at some of these conferences, we're saying, come on guys, what do you want us to do here? Because you know you won't allow us to demolish, and nobody wants to demolish these buildings. Yet at the same time, we don't have $15 million to start this project. And I can tell you in the case of McDougall, and I'm aware that some of the information that I'm just saying now, the leadership team is aware. We haven't, you know, there's communication stuff going on all the time. But part of us trying to crack the code here is getting good, sensible, experienced builders into those buildings to look and give a common sense answer. And I want to say the common sense answer, if presented well, is the best answer to any heritage concerns of a building. To say, here, we know we have all these problems to deal with. We tried our best here. This building's been lovingly looked after. However, these following things are not yet done. And here is our plan of attack. And sometimes that plan of attack includes putting netting up on falling masonry. It includes painting over or sealing asbestos. I mean, there are things that need to be done to get in and try. And what I find is that by preparing a sensible plan and communicating it well, most people are willing to get in line. Now, of course, there are occasionally very difficult local heritage activists who aren't taking into account the bigger picture. And like people, so I can tell you one of the hardest things in church is getting parishioners to understand why the pews need to come out. I'm not saying we've gotten to that point at McDougall, by the way. But you know, the only way you can use a church more widely is to open up the floor space. But that takes time for people to understand, and you have to listen and hear and understand what their perspectives are. Similarly with local heritage folks, hearing and listening and taking time to talk is important. At the same time, we need to step up the level of urgency and realize not all conversations, there isn't time in certain cases to have every possible conversation we want to have. And I have to say, I'm so thankful for the team we have across Canada, some of the best in Canada, architects, heritage planners, etc., who can come around to church and a community and help them understand how hard some of these decisions of heritage planning and construction really are.
A huge challenge, Graham, no doubt. And I mean, we're very thankful for our heritage structures. We've seen many cities that have lost a lot of their heritage. We were talking about Kingston earlier. I mean, in the 70s and 80s, they were bulldozing limestone buildings left, right, and center. And only now do they realize that what a loss that they've incurred. But there are still a lot of historic properties in downtown Edmonton and downtown Calgary and throughout the province, for example. On the subject of history, though, Gordon is always a good source of Edmonton history. He mentions that Wesley United Church has become an Aboriginal center when it amalgamated with Robertson. So there is some progress in that regard. But I think, you know, restitution and reconciliation with our Indigenous communities is an important factor in, you know, more in some cities than others. You know, Winnipeg, it must be a huge challenge, for example. That's, you know, the whole north half of the city is in that situation. Restoring these historic buildings, of course, as you know, and as you alluded to, it's expensive. The city and the province were very generous with McDougall a number of years back. A total of $1.25 million was quickly spent. And as you know, that there are many millions of dollars that are still required for that building. And so that is a huge challenge that any development plan will encounter on just about any historic property. We're coming to the end of our time, but I'd like to give you a chance to sort of tell us a little bit about something that I know you're passionate about, and that is the community foundations. We have an excellent relationship with the community foundation here in Edmonton, and of course, I'm sure the same is true in Calgary. But I know you're working also at the national level on community foundations, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about that and how that interfaces with the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so it might be helpful, and I'm sure you'll have many people more experienced than I to give more background about community foundations. But for somebody who really doesn't know, I mean, it's one of those phrases you hear and you think, okay, a community foundation must be a foundation that's to do with community. But it's slightly more specific than that. I think there are about 180 community foundations in Canada. And if you think of the United Way as a general charity that somebody could give money to, I mean, if somebody died and said, I'd like some of my money to be left to charity, and they hadn't specified the charity, the estate trustees would probably give it to United Way. It's a very, very good general charity. Community foundations operate slightly differently, where families can actually invest in the community foundation and hold assets there with a view to those being dispersed for charitable purposes. And then the community foundation will then invest those. Now, community foundations, like many other granting foundations, would see a need to disperse 3.5–4% of that holding every year. The question now becomes, what about the other 95%? And Andrew Trinity, the CEO of Community Foundations Canada, recently gave an absolutely impassioned speech to the Ontario Nonprofit Network, where he said, for heaven's sake, 4% is so low. And he said, despite COVID, these investments have been doing incredibly well. And some of our audience here may well have experienced that the stock market has made a recovery. Now, it could see lots of, we could be in for a roller coaster ride in the stock market. For heaven's sake, we're watching the UK go into a new lockdown right now. But my point with community foundations is that they have done well, they are very well managed, and they are looking to ask the question, what about the 95%? What about universities or pension funds that say, we disperse a certain amount, we invest a certain amount? How could those investments themselves actually generate community or social impact? Now, for those of you who are far more have far more understanding of accounting principles here, or investment principles, you'll know that Alberta has benefited from a concept called flow-through shares with investment in new mining territories, right? Where through the tax code, very wealthy people particularly are encouraged to invest in the development of virgin land, right? It's an example of something. What would it look like? So now, Paul, you go back to our McDougall, and let's imagine that we, in the end, we need $15 million to see that project happen. Now, that's not a crazy number. We hope we can get it down to significantly less than that, but just throw it out there to understand the scale of the challenge. Imagine we could create an investment product for Edmontonians to be able to invest in that project, have their investment actually secured, but make a return which was both a financial return as well as a return in impact. And forget about circus for a minute. Maybe that's completely irrelevant for Edmonton. Maybe it is Aboriginal issues. Maybe it is, and this is what we need to learn about what does Edmonton need going into the future. And by the way, whatever Edmonton thought it needed pre-COVID is going to be completely different post-COVID. This needs to be completely rethought, right? So the point is, how could a community foundation that already has the mandate to do this kind of investment, okay? And by the way, I'm sorry if I'm giving too much detail on here, but an investment that has no backing in any kind of asset, if it was, maybe let's call it a bond, if it has no asset, it's a debenture. It's a much higher risk investment, which is why many charities can't really use social impact investment facilities. The one group of charities that has actual assets to lean against are churches, right? They could actually work with the community foundation's vision and many other granting foundations, and even if I can say, ordinary middle-class families who've invested and done well and have maybe a property and a cottage and some other and they're now starting to realize, I have all the money I need to give my kids a little bit of a head start, but I would like to invest. That's a typical kind of family that might invest in a community foundation kind of instrument. They're now saying, I have everything I need. I want this money to grow. but I also wanted to do something significant. Now, I don't mean to impugn all the banks in one fell swoop here, but the banks are dependent on fund management charges, which pay the banks profits, right? I mean, that's how they're set up. And good for the banks, you know, we all need them. But for heaven's sake, how do we look and say, this is the kind of work where people should not be making profit off of this work. This is not a donation, but it's not a conventional investment. This is truly an impact investment. And I'm not betting, I don't bet things, but if I was to lean on something, I would say community foundations in Canada are leading the way in this. And I think I would say watch that space. And that's what we're watching. And we're trying to chase them with saying, I've got all these church buildings, nobody knows what to do with them. You know, we're working with them, but the answers are very few and far between. You've got some capital that needs investing, you know, let's put these together. So there's a long answer to a big opportunity, and I hope that's of interest to our audience today.
I think that's a great note to end on. It's a really, you know, a layman's explanation of this particular investment opportunity and the opportunities that the city is presented with at all levels, individual and organizational, and of course government. So that's very, very helpful. And you know, as John has mentioned, and as you have mentioned, you know, technology is something we've become, you know, more comfortable with even during this COVID crisis, and that too changes our perspective in terms of what lies within the art of the possible as we truly, you know, throw open the doors and try to envision something really new, not just for McDougall, but for other properties that you're working with, or for other properties that you might wish to bring on board. You mentioned at the beginning that you'd like to see 100 churches or 100 historic properties repurposed, and I of course we wish you every success in that regard. I think you've left us or given us a very positive and optimistic message to draw out the end of the year, and this is absolutely our last video presentation of the year. So we'll kick off in the new year, as I mentioned earlier, with the premier, and of course this is my opportunity, Graham, to thank you and to wish your family well during this cloistered Christmas we're about to experience. And you know, be safe in Montreal, and every success in your endeavors. So my thanks again.
Thank you so much, Paul. And we're I tell you this as a little vignette in closing, that our children are outside, and we're up in northern Quebec for Christmas, and they found in a ditch, they found a puddle of water that's turned into a long frozen ramp in the ditch, and they've turned it into a curling rink. Now, if my kids from Quebec created a curling rink, isn't that a good thing for Alberta? Isn't that a bit of Alberta love back at you guys?
That is the love. And you know, my wife curled in the Scottish, and I didn't know you had Scottish heritage, which she does as well. So she's going to be thrilled to hear that. She is a banker though, and I don't think she took offense at any of your comments about bankers. So Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Thanks again, Paul.
Thank you, of course, to all the membership for joining us today. We have a few last slides. Just a brief thank you to the ADR Institute of Alberta for loaning us the Zoom technology for an administrative support for today's presentation. Also, just a reminder that, of course, on January 20th at 11:30, in conjunction with both the Calgary and the Edmonton clubs, we will be hosting Premier Jason Kenney to start off our new year with a video talk and presentation. And of course, anyone that's interested in learning more about the Canadian Club of Edmonton and hopefully our resumption of in-person luncheons by September, we're optimistic. We're going to be optimistic as well in that regard, but you will find website details and an opportunity to sign up for the newsletter. I wish everyone a very safe and happy holiday season. Please respect the provincial guidelines. Please keep your family clusters to your household. Be safe. Look forward to your vaccines. 2021 has a lot in store for us, a lot of promise and potential, and even some semblance of normal. So happy holidays, and thank you again for joining us today. You can throw your comments into the chat column. And again, Graham, our thanks for being with us today. Goodbye, everybody.